Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Butler. I'm a Consumer Education and Outreach Specialist in the Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division in the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau here at the FCC. I would like to thank those of you viewing online today. The Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau develops and implements FCC's consumer policy and serves as the agency's connection to the American consumer. Our mission includes disability rights, consumer education, and outreach to state, local, and tribal governments. CAOD develops and implements consumer outreach and education policies, goals, and objectives, and ensures that the Commission has the benefit of a wide spectrum of information and viewpoints in its decision-making processes. CAOD plans, develops, and conducts consumer outreach and education initiatives to inform the public about important consumer-related regulatory programs. In our effort to reach as many consumers as possible, CAOD partners with various consumer organizations to share information with its members. If there is anyone viewing this webinar today who would like to partner with us, please contact me by email at anthony.butler@fcc.gov. Today's topic of discussion is robocalls. During this webinar, we will provide you with information about consumer rights and steps consumers can take to prevent robocalls. Today's speakers are Christy Thornton, Associate Division Chief, Consumer Policy Division, Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. Christy Thompson, not to be confused with Christy Thornton, is the Deputy Chief, Telecommunications Consumer Division, Enforcement Bureau, and Antonio Sweet from the Technology Policy Advisor, Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis. There will be a QA at the end of the final presentation. Those of you viewing online can submit your questions via email to robocallswebinar@fcc.gov. Thanks again, and let's get started.
Thanks, Anthony.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Thornton. I'm going to start this afternoon by talking a little bit about what the Telephone Consumer Protection Act is. Then I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about consumer complaints and the process of filing those and what the Commission does with them. Then I'm going to move on to talk about the Commission's work in the area of robocalls and decisions the Commission has made recently with robocalls. And that's what I'm planning to speak on before passing it on to Christy Thompson. So the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, what we shortened to TCPA, was passed by Congress in 1991, and it was enacted to address certain calling practices thought to be an invasion of consumer privacy and a risk to public safety. One of Congress's stated goals in enacting the TCPA was to reasonably accommodate an individual's right to privacy, but also to consider the legitimate business interest of telemarketers and of other callers. So it recognized the legitimate interest of telemarketing, but it also stated that unrestricted telemarketing could be an invasion of privacy and a risk to public safety. The TCPA also provided greater protection for wireless consumers who may be charged per call. So in 1991, Congress recognized cell phone numbers and the use of cell phone cost consumers money, and it wanted to provide greater protection for those consumers. When we think about the TCPA, we often think of calls to your cell phone and of robocalls, but the TCPA does more than that. It regulates telemarketing calls through the do not call list, among others. It regulates fax advertising, including prohibiting unsolicited fax ads. And then, of course, it regulates robocalls. And the Commission defines that as calls made using an autodialer or an artificial voice or a pre-recorded voice. And those calls can include both informational and telemarketing robocalls. We often think of robocalls as strictly sales calls or telemarketing calls, but robocalls can also be informational calls. And I was told to sit closer, so I'm going to try and do that. Thank you. So consumer complaints, which I'm sure is why many of you are tuning in today. The TCPA, like I said, was passed in 1991, but the TCPA, in the TCPA, it enacted some longstanding protections. Despite that, robocalls are regularly a top complaint category at the Commission. Consumers have a number of ways to let the Commission know that they are having a problem with robocalls. Consumers can file a complaint on the Commission's website, and at the very end of my presentation, I'll give you that web address where you can do that. The Commission uses that complaint information in a number of ways. Probably most importantly, the Commission takes enforcement action on violation, and it uses complaint data in determining how to act on those complaints, how to proceed in enforcement actions. The Commission is also considering ways to help consumers file robocall complaints more easily. So if you've been on the Commission's website previously, you might want to look for changes coming soon. But filing a complaint is not all you can do. The TCPA includes in it a provision that allows consumers to make a private right of action. So if you receive a robocall in violation of the TCPA, you may file a lawsuit in court under that private right of action contained in the TCPA. The Commission also recognizes that something we call reassigned wireless numbers is a big problem for consumers and also for callers. Reassigned wireless numbers is where a consumer gives consent to receive robocalls to his wireless phone number, his cell phone number, and then unbeknownst to the caller, the person wanting to make calls, that consumer gives up your cell phone number and it's reassigned or inherited by someone who hasn't given consent to receive those calls. The Commission and others are thinking of ways to address this problem, such as possibly a comprehensive reassigned numbers database that could be accessed by callers. And so we understand it's a problem for consumers and for callers, and we are looking to work with others to address that problem. I want to touch next on TCPA robocall issues and action the Commission is taking. The Commission has recently taken major actions concerning TCPA and robocall issues, and those actions affect calls to both your home and your wireless or cell phone numbers, and they also affect both telemarketing and informational calls. If you've interacted with the TCPA before, either as a consumer or as an attorney or as an advocate, you likely know that the TCPA imposes consent restrictions on callers, and you've probably, as a consumer, given your consent to receive phone calls. The TCPA sets forth, and the Commission's interpretation of it sets forth requirements on what type of consent is required for certain calls. Some calls require no consent, and those would be auto-dialed or pre-recorded or artificial voice informational calls, political calls, and nonprofit calls to your home phone. A caller does not need your consent to make those calls. Some calls do require consent, either written consent or written or oral consent. Written consent is needed, prior express written consent is needed for pre-recorded voice telemarketing calls made to your residential number. It's also needed for auto-dialed or pre-recorded or artificial voice telemarketing calls made to your wireless number. And then a different type of consent, written or oral consent, either in writing or through your voice, is needed for auto-dialed or pre-recorded artificial voice informational calls to your wireless cell phone number. The Commission clarified that a few years ago, and those consent requirements are in our rules. And then most recently, the Commission, this last July 2016, issued a declaratory ruling setting forth clarifications on calls made by schools and also calls made by utilities. And I wanted to talk a little bit about those, since those are things that many of us interact with every day. Last August, the decision was voted in July and issued in August. The Commission issued a declaratory ruling clarifying what an emergency purpose call is with regard to schools and to utilities. And it also discussed the concept of a closely related call. So calls made for an emergency purpose, and the term emergency purpose is defined in the Commission's rules. Calls made for an emergency purpose do not require you giving your prior express consent to the person making the call. So no consent is needed to send an emergency robocall about the weather or threats or unexcused absences from schools. The Commission also clarified that consent for robocalls that are closely related to the school's mission comes when you give your phone number to the school. And those include examples such as notification of an upcoming teacher conference or a general school activity. And then utility calls, the Commission offered some clarification there as well, and said that consent for robocalls that are closely related to utility service, again, comes with giving your phone number to the company. You don't have to provide separate consent to receive those robocalls. Giving your phone number to the company is consent to receive those closely related utility service calls. And the Commission gave a number of examples of what those might be. And so that you have complete information, I wanted to read this for you as well. Calls such as those that warn about planned or unplanned service outages, provide updates about service outages or service restoration. Calls that ask for confirmation of service restoration or information about lack of service, provide notification of meter work or tree trimming or other field work that directly affects the customer's utility service. Calls that notify consumers they may be eligible for subsidized or low-cost services due to certain qualifiers such as age or low income or disability. And finally, calls that provide information about potential brownouts due to heavy energy usage. And those, are the clarifications the Commission issued this last summer regarding school calls and utility calls. In conclusion, I wanted to make sure that you knew that in the area of robocalls, at any time you can revoke consent or ask calls to stop. And if a caller is complying with the TCPA, they should honor that request. This won't work for emergency calls or for calls that do not require consent. Again, those would be political calls and nonprofit calls to your residential line. And as a final reminder, you can file a complaint with the FCC. We encourage you to do that if you received a call in violation of the TCPA. You can do that by going to fcc.gov and clicking on the link to file a consumer complaint. And with that, I will hand it over to Christy Thompson.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Christy Thompson. Obviously, that was not Christy Thompson, who was just doing some technical configurations there. I am the Deputy Division Chief in the Enforcement Bureau's Telecommunications Consumers Division, which is a long title for saying that I am the robocall cop. So what I do is I'm the Chief Enforcement Attorney who oversees TCPA enforcement at the FCC. I am in the trenches going after the bad guys, trying to find out who is calling you with that attractive offer, who's behind the Rachel from Cardholder Services scam, for example, and any number of other scams and unwanted robocalls that consumers receive across the country at an alarming rate. The TCPA and robocalling enforcement in particular is a top priority for the FCC. As my colleague, who also named Christy, mentioned, TCPA violations and illegal robocalls in particular are at the top of the consumer complaints list, the number of consumer complaints that we as an agency receive, and some of the most pernicious harms that are affecting consumers today are in fact perpetrated by criminal fraudsters, identity theft rings, and other individuals and companies that use mass spoofed robocalls in order to perpetrate significant frauds on the American people. For example, they may use spoofed robocalls with or send out text messages indicating that they're with the IRS. Spoiler alert, not actually with the IRS. The IRS does not make robocalls threatening to put you in jail if you haven't, paid them. And they certainly do not take green dot cards or prepaid Visa cards to pay your taxes with. So that is one of the more well-known scams that's going around now. And these scammers use robocalls to try and frighten people into calling them back. And they spoof the numbers, genuine IRS numbers, in order to make their calls look legitimate. So we are very concerned with calls that don't obey the TCPA and don't obey the federal do not call regulations. And if you're curious as to why it seems that robocalls are such a bigger problem now than they ever have been in the past, it's really a function of how cheaply and easy it is to make mass robocalling campaigns. For pennies or even fractions of a penny per call, it is very easy to send out millions of calls per day. And in fact, we do see those patterns that some of the worst offenders are making millions of calls to millions of Americans every single day. So with that, that is obviously with that state of mind, that state of things being as they are, that makes it a top priority for us to do something about it. We have millions of consumers who are being harmed, and we need to figure out who they are and stop them. And another increasing area of consumer concern has to do with spam text messages, which are a little bit different than robocalls. Right now, the text message spam problem is small, especially compared to the robocalling or unwanted telemarketing problems that consumers are experiencing. But we certainly do not want the same magnitude or problems that we see with illegal robocalls to crop up in the text messaging service. Right now, and I'm sure anybody with a teenager can tell you, text messages are one of, if not the, lifeblood communication for millions of consumers. And there is a real threat that if text message spam gets out of control, it will lessen the usefulness of text messaging as a communications platform. That's something that we do not want to see. So to speak generally about what the Enforcement Bureau does here at the FCC, we get thousands of consumer complaints every single month. We look at the complaints and analyze them for trends to see where it is that we need to spend our limited resources. And over time, we witness older problems stop and new problems take precedence, especially in line with changes to technology. So, for example, as I mentioned before, the increase in robocalling complaints is a direct result of robocalling technology becoming much cheaper and much easier to obtain. We also take into account, when we're setting our enforcement priorities, the realities of being a small federal agency with not unlimited resources. We don't have the resources, for example, to pursue every single possible violation of the Communications Act that's out there. So we focus on curbing the most pernicious harms, the harms that affect the greatest number of people, that pose the greatest risk to the greatest number of people. And the TCPA falls squarely into that category, in particular robocalls. So how we find the bad guys in the first place, and this is the crux, and I think what a lot of consumers are curious about. They go to our website, they say, I got this bad call, they file it with the government, and certainly before I joined the government, I always wondered if anybody actually opened the black box that my complaint went into and looked at it. And the answer is yes, we do, in fact, look at all of the complaints that consumers give to us. One of the primary sources of figuring out where to hunt down the bad guys comes from consumer complaints that we receive. There are cases, however, especially with respect to spoofed calls, where consumer complaints may not contain all of the information that we need in order to figure out and find out who is the person responsible for making those calls. So in those cases, we have to expand our activities a bit, and we work cooperatively with the carriers to find the sources of that unlawful traffic. The carriers are your allies in this. They hate fraudulent traffic just as much as you do and as we do, because those illegal robocalls, those millions of calls that get placed to phone numbers across the country every single day, cost the carriers money. They burden the networks with garbage traffic. They disrupt consumers and their ability to get the calls that they want and not have to be harassed. And they generate complaints to the carriers, as we're not the only ones that get complaints, but the carriers get complaints. Can't you do something about these unwanted robocalls that I keep getting and turn them off somehow? So we are allies with the carriers in trying to stop unlawful robocalls. Our investigators also pay attention to other places where consumers may complain, such as blogs, technology blogs, and consumer protection blogs that are out there talking about experiences that consumers have had with robocalls. And we try and look for patterns and identify who may be responsible for some of the worst offenses that we see. So this summer and fall, we worked with the telecom industry as well, meaning your carriers, as well as equipment manufacturers such as Apple, Google, Nokia, and others, on the telecom industry's robocall strike force to work on long-term solutions to the problem of illegal robocalls. And this really goes back to the holistic approach that we're taking with respect to robocall enforcement. It's not just chasing after every single consumer complaint that's out there, although that's extremely valuable, but it's also working at the carrier level to try and figure out where the ingress points are for illegal traffic and then shutting them off at the source. These solutions are going to include technological changes, which my colleague Antonio Sweet will be talking about, and methods of increased cooperation between the carriers and the government and basically all stakeholders. These efforts have already started to pay off. This fall, we worked in conjunction with the strike force and the Treasury's Internal Revenue Service to try and put a stop to those IRS scam calls that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. And our efforts were extremely successful. There was a reduction by over 90% in the fall of 2016 of those illegal IRS scam calls. So that was a tremendous success that we are looking to build upon so that we can further reduce illegal robocalls in 2017 and in the future. In the meantime, and as my colleague Christy mentioned, consumers can continue to help us find the bad guys by filing complaints on our website. And I want to say, as I mentioned before, even if you don't receive a personal response back, don't despair. It does not mean that your complaint is not important. It does not mean that no one has read it. In fact, the contrary is true. The Enforcement Bureau meets with the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, who collects the consumer complaints, on a regular basis to talk about problems that consumers are reporting so that we can identify quickly what the trends are and where we need to focus our enforcement efforts. We can't do that without consumer complaints that people all around the country let us know what it is that they are experiencing. We wouldn't know where to focus our efforts, in fact, if we didn't have consumers telling us what the problems are that they have. So when you file a complaint in particular about an illegal robocall or an illegal text spam or an auto-dialed telemarketing call that you think violates the TCPA, most helpful to include the date and time that you received the call or the text message, the phone number where you received the call. If it's a cell phone or a landline, it would be helpful to know that as well. The name of your phone carrier and the number that appeared on caller ID. We use these pieces of information to try and trace back the origin of that call. Because most of the most harmful robocalls and junk text messages are also spoofed, we need to have information like the date and time and the caller ID that did show up and who actually got the number, your recipient's phone number in the complaint so that we can attempt to trace that back with the information that we do have. So to reiterate, robocall enforcement is a top priority here at the FCC. It is something that consumers and Congress all agree needs to have more work done, and we look forward to finding the sources of the largest scale operators of illegal robocalls, and our goal is to put them out of business so that Americans can have some peace and quiet. And with that, I will turn it over to Antonio Sweet, and happy to take any questions that folks may have at the end. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Antonio Sweet, and I'm a technology policy advisor in the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis. So following up on the remarks from my colleagues earlier, I'm going to walk through the evolution of the phone system, the evolution of robocalls, how technologists and engineers have been working on the back end to secure the networks and provide more protections for consumers, and what technology is available to you to implement and reduce or mitigate the robocalls and potential fraud that you're being targeted with. So as we look back at the original phone system, we recall that it was a single-in, single-out network where one phone could either place a call or it could receive a call, and only one of those could happen at a given time. And the number that was used to reach that particular phone was the only way to do so, meaning the 10-digit number that was dialed is not only an identity for the phone that you're trying to reach, but also conveyed how the call path reached that phone. So we had area codes that gave large offices routing information to where it would go throughout the country. And then once it landed in an office in that area code's area, then it would be directed even further down into more granular detail until it finally reached the exact phone that the caller was trying to get to. And the way that the numbering system worked was all based on what is known as a root of trust, where phone providers knew that the number that they were passing along was guaranteed by the company that they were connecting to. So various companies operating different parts of the larger phone network across the country and across the world could have some reassurance that their subscribers or their customers were going to, in fact, reach the person that they were dialing. This dramatically changed with the advent of the internet and email, where now you had connections that were capable of doing multiple messages in, multiple messages out at the same time, and the architecture for that also allowed for people to put forth the identity that they wanted rather than one that was given to them by a company. So we have domain names and email addresses that are not necessarily tied to a location, but rather tied to the identity that an individual wants to present themselves as. Much the same way that paper mail envelopes simply require a name that you choose and the address that it's going to be delivered to. If you change the recipient's name, that won't change the mail getting to that location, but it will indicate whether or not that person receiving it at the end is the right recipient. So the internet and email architecture allowed for anonymity regardless of the route that the packet of information took, which was very different from how phone networks operated. And so when we think about how email spam first emerged, it took advantage of really effective marketing software that provided rapid delivery of the same message to millions of people. And as we heard earlier, the cost effectiveness of this technique is really what allowed mass mailers with actual postcards to be profitable, but also has allowed for robocalling today to be profitable as well. So if you think about, let's say, 250 million adults in the U.S., all being reached by a single robocaller for fractions of a penny per call, and that can be done in the matter of a month, you can also assume that only 1 in a million people fall for a particular marketing scam, and with 1 in a million giving up, let's say, $1,000, that population that robocaller reached in a month can turn into a $250,000 profit for that marketing campaign. And so what we're seeing is that malicious attackers are taking advantage of the low cost, not necessarily high yield, but high reward overall for their effort. And what has happened to email service is that it has evolved to increase its security, increase its filters for spam and unwanted messages, and that is largely how spam filters and email authentication were born. Very few people know that there is an organization known as the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, made up of volunteer technology experts from across industries that work specifically on improving the internet. And so as we think about how the phone network has expanded to include not just the traditional landline phones, but also voice networks that are a hybrid or interconnected with the internet itself, enabling things like Wi-Fi calling or VoIP, we see that there are going to need to be similar steps taken in the new voice context as were in the email context. So the IETF, as I mentioned, previously developed security protocols that you may have noticed as you browse the web or read your email, for example. The little green lock that indicates that you are in fact reaching the website that you wanted or are getting an email from, let's say, your financial institution, are the result of some pretty sophisticated upgrades that include cryptography, message encryption, and connection encryption as well. And what is being done now is a focus on bringing that technology to voice services, not just message services. And so what we have to understand is how robocalling and spoofing are currently enabled, and then we'll talk about how it's being addressed. So robocallers use a variety of techniques, some of which we heard about earlier. Those include auto-dialing, which can happen, like I previously said, thousands of times per minute, as well as artificial voice, so you don't need a person at a phone to make a call and to interact with a call recipient. But you also have spoofing, and there are different flavors to spoofing, I would say. So we have anonymized spoofing, where the call recipient or the call number that the robocaller is using is completely random. And that will enable them to reach a very broad target audience, as well as being able to completely randomize their identity as well. So the caller ID that shows up on your phone will be a random 10-digit number that has nothing to do with the identity or the location of the caller. You also have a technique known as neighborhooding, where the caller will specifically use, let's say, the first 3 or the first 6 digits of the call recipient's number, changing the last 4, so that it looks like you're receiving a call from a local number, maybe someone in your neighborhood. And that's pretty easy to accomplish through the software that's being used today. You also have impersonation, where someone is maybe able to get access to your contact list, and they pick a number out of that contact list and use that as their identity, so that when it shows up on your phone, you recognize it as someone you know, and you pick up and start engaging with the person. Another one is to impersonate an authority figure, such as the IRS. We've seen that the number that shows up on people's caller ID will in fact match the public-facing phone number for federal agencies, and thus tricking people more so than they would if it were a random number that they could look up quickly. And so these challenges are what are being addressed by the technology that's being developed. And so there are important considerations that are being taken when developing them. For example, as I mentioned earlier, there are legacy networks interconnected with internet-based voice networks, and those are largely only partially interoperable, meaning that information that might go from an internet-based call to another internet-based call will not work if they are going from internet-based call to a traditional landline. And a lot of that information being lost results in a lack of traceability, making it very difficult for my colleagues in the Enforcement Bureau to go after people if a consumer files a complaint that came over a landline network, for example. The other difference between the voice networks and the email case is that with email, it's actually very easy to check whether or not the message is repeated over and over again to millions of targets. In the voice context, the content of the message doesn't start until someone picks up the phone, making tracing and tracking patterns through the network much more difficult. And as I said, the ease of spoofing that is enabled through the software that spoofers use has been found as readily available and as commonplace as app stores for mobile phones. And unfortunately, there are many more spoofing apps and software products than there are anti-spoofing and filtering products. And so hopefully what is being done right now through organizations like the IETF and other technologists are to counter those and to make consumer-friendly and consumer protection services more readily available. So one thing primarily will be essentially the green lock for phone numbers. So if you place an internet-based phone call, your identity will be verified through an encrypted certificate that your phone network will pass to the call recipient so that the call recipient can trust that it is in fact you that is calling. On your phone, you will eventually see something like this and know that the number showing up is not spoofed, is not readily faked by someone who is trying to trick you into something. Now, that does not necessarily mean that you're going to like what's on the other end of that call, but it will give you some reassurance as to the identity. Another bit of technology that's being developed is kind of a parallel to the do not call list, known as the do not originate list. And what that does is it looks at the identity of the phone number and it looks at its call path that it came from, where it originated from. And if there is a mismatch or an inconsistency, it will block the call. So as we heard earlier about the IRS scam that was reduced by 90%, that was the result of implementing the IRS's phone number in this do not originate list so that calls, for example, from India with the IRS's number were not passed through because it's obvious that the IRS would not be making calls from overseas. In addition, we're also developing traceback coordination, automated traceback coordination, so that we don't need to individually and manually go through all the steps in the call path in order to find out where it came from. And there are consumer services being developed as well. And there's a very wide variety of those. And it's important to know that what is available to you depends a lot on, as I said, the type of network service that you use. For example, your mobile phone versus your landline phone versus a VoIP landline service all have different capabilities because of the types of networks that they operate on. So one type is called a caller challenge, very similar to a CAPTCHA message that you might see on some websites when you're making a purchase. When on those websites you're asked to type in a keyword to prove that you're not a robot, in this context it will respond to the caller, asking the caller to dial a random 4-digit code to prove that they are not an auto dialer. In addition, there's technology known as phone printing, parallel to fingerprinting, where the characteristics of the voice message or the caller are mapped to historical records and audio of previous calls that are in databases. So if you pick up and an auto voice starts talking to you and the software detects that that same audio has existed and has been played elsewhere on the network, it will alert you that it is associated with a large-scale campaign and potentially a fraudulent campaign. There are also very simple call blocking apps that crowdsource complaints from the user base. And as more and more people use those types of apps, the data that is collected and used in algorithms to filter out calls, much like spam filters, gets improved. And so we encourage people to look into what spam filters and call blocking apps and software is available for them. The most strict case of call filtering would be a whitelist app that essentially says, do not let any calls through unless it's on this list or in this contact database. And in those instances, you will reduce the amount of random calls that you get. And while it does potentially affect the call experience for people that are not on your contact list trying to reach you, many people have found that it has been very effective, and the other means of communication technology enable people to ultimately reach a person if they're not on that whitelist. And as I mentioned, these apps are available through carriers if you're on a landline or a VoIP service, as well as in app stores for your mobile phone. The most consistent advice that we give to consumers to protect themselves from getting these calls in the first place is to not pick up calls from unknown numbers. It's well known that there are random calls placed simply to find out if a number is tied to an active person or a user rather than one that is inactive. And what that does is it lets a caller know that this is a person that can be reached and is known to pick up calls. As well, we encourage people to file complaints on the FCC's Consumer Complaint Database, specifically because it is tied to many of these third-party spam filtering apps, and the personal information is redacted for privacy purposes, but the information is also added to the user base and data that enhances the spam filter's capabilities. And so we encourage you to keep reaching out to us for any additional information, and also to visit fcc.gov/robocalls to look at the various resources that we have both within our agency as well as other government agencies and companies as well. So thank you very much, and I believe we'll turn it over now to question and answers.
Okay, we received a couple of questions online while our presentations were being given. And I guess this first question is for Antonio. First one says, are the three types of spoofing Antonio discussed defined on the FCC site? If not, is a copy available?
Yeah, so the various types of spoofing, while not an exhaustive list of the techniques, are listed on many consumer websites, and I'm not sure I've seen the latest version of the Robocalls page on the FCC's website, but we can certainly add that if people believe that is helpful. Thanks.
All right, next question. Excuse me for a minute. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties as far as volume, so hold on, please, while we try to adjust that. All right, our next question is about spoofing. It says, while I normally do not answer calls if I don't recognize the number, I received a call recently where they had to take my caller ID so it looked like my phone was receiving a call from my own phone. I called my phone carrier and they said that this did not mean that they had gotten into my phone, that they had just taken the call ID information. Do you hear this often? I no longer have the date and time because I just traded in my phone.
Hi, I'm happy to field that question. The answer is yes. We see that very frequently. It's known as caller ID mirror spoofing, where the spoofer will take the caller number, the number that they're trying to dial, and then replicate that in the caller ID so that it ends up looking like you are getting a call from your own phone line. The carrier's correct. There is it's not possible for you to make a call to yourself that connects to anything other than, perhaps your voicemail if you wanted to call your own voicemail. So that is correct. It's not a case of the caller having somehow gained access to your phone. It's just they have a computer program that mirrors the destination number to also show up as the caller ID number. And they do that because as a way to avoid, well, first of all, to mask who it is who's actually calling, which is the primary purpose. And then second, to avoid detection by the carrier's filtration or their internal flagging system that indicates when a call is likely to be illegal or problematic. So that's a technique that the spoofers use to try and get you to answer the phone, get you on the line, and to evade detection and hide who it is, where they're really coming from. Next one.
I've gotten calls where the callers do not say anything when I answer. Some of the calls appears targeted at my age group, i.e. Medicare. How do I get my information, especially my phone number? Or how do they get my information, especially my phone number, since it is unpublished? Where do they get my personal information, and how do I get them to stop?
Hi there. So specifically in this case where you pick up the phone and you don't hear anything, that is not necessarily indicative of someone gaining access to your personal information. It's actually most likely that someone randomly picked your number and you just got unlucky. In that case, what you want to do is make sure that, as I said before, you are not speaking to the person. You're not picking up the phone if it is someone who does not show up in your contact list. And as always, make sure that you're filing a complaint to the FCC.
What is being done about the no caller ID robocalls? I realize these would be much harder to track and suspect the origin is outside of our borders. I also strongly feel consumers should not have to enlist our provider to block these types of calls at extra cost to the consumer. These are by far the types of calls I receive the most, and since the caller blocks their origin, I can effectively report it to the FCC.
Hi, so that is a great question, and this is an area where consumer privacy, there are two different parts of consumer privacy that can sometimes come in conflict with each other. And what I mean by that is this. There is a strong desire, and this is encoded right into the Communications Act and the Truth of Caller ID Act of 2009, that consumers have the right to block their own caller ID from showing up on the calls that they make. So for example, if you have a typical smartphone, there's usually a feature somewhere on your smartphone that will say show my caller ID or do not show my caller ID. And the purpose of that is so that you can make a call to someone you don't necessarily want them to see your personal information showing up. So that is one example of a consumer desire to block their own caller ID. But on the other hand, you have the problem that you described, where there are malicious spoofers who block caller ID specifically for the purpose of avoiding detection. And that is a problematic use that the law, the Truth in Caller ID Act, draws a distinction between. So it says in the law that it is okay and permissible and nothing is going to interfere with a consumer's ability to turn off his or her own caller ID from being transmitted. But if you are spoofing or blocking caller ID for the purposes of enacting a fraud against another person, then you violate the law. So the answer to your question about what it is we're doing about it is we are attempting to find large-scale robocallers who are blocking caller ID for the purposes of making illegal calls and turning those calls off at the source. So the fact that no caller ID is transmitted with the call is a red flag that we try to use to identify where those calls are coming from. So we'll work with the carriers and say, hey, it looks like there's 10 million calls coming across your network today that have no caller ID. This looks suspicious, and we work with the carriers to try and figure out who it is who's really sending those calls.
Next question. What sort of effort is the FCC making towards solutions expanding beyond our borders? More specifically, robocalls both come from and to the U.S. How are we collaborating with others, say the CRTC?
Hi, thanks for that question. So it's a really important point that the calls that we hear complaints about are, one, very often, almost 99% of the time, originating over internet networks, and two, many of them, and the majority of them, are originating outside of U.S. borders. And the standards that are being set for caller ID authentication that I mentioned earlier, that little green lock for the phone number, is actually an international effort that groups or agencies like the CRTC in Canada are looking at, Ofcom in the UK. We are in talks with partners in Asia and Australia, New Zealand, all over the world to make sure that any solution that is implemented doesn't suffer from a weak link attack where one area or one part of the network that doesn't adopt security standards, it makes the entire network vulnerable. So not only are technology companies overseas working with their regulators, but we are working with as many partners as we can outside of the borders as well to make sure that there are as few vulnerabilities as possible.
Yeah, and let me jump in and say also on the enforcement side, we work with our counterparts in numerous international jurisdictions because we recognize that some of the worst calls are coming from overseas, and try and work with them to figure out where the calls are coming from and if they can stop them if they're coming from particular nations, work with those nations to get those call centers shut down. I think there's last question. Last question is coming up.
Last question. When reporting robocalls, can the consumer see a list of companies or organizations that have been already reported? If so, where on your website can that be found? Yes, you can find that information on our website at fcc.gov/unwanted-calls. All right, so that was our last question, and this will be the end of our Robocall webinar today. I thank you all for participating, and you all have a good day.